Hi, I'm Natalie. 15 years ago, my stepfather told me I wasn't family enough to be included in the annual Christmas card photo. He said it would confuse people who didn't know our situation. Last month, he begged me to add his name to the deed of the 12-acre vineyard estate I inherited. I told him it would confuse the lawyers who didn't know our situation either. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the windows of our suburban split-level house in Riverside, Oregon, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the neighbors' perfectly manicured lawns. I was 17, sprawled across my bedroom carpet with college application essays scattered around me like fallen leaves, when my mother's voice drifted up from the living room. She was laughing at something Richard had said, that particular laugh she reserved for him. Light, musical, desperate to please. I should have known something was wrong when she called me downstairs with her company voice, the one she used when the pastor visited, or when Richard's colleagues came for dinner. "Natalie, honey, can you come down here for a minute?" The living room looked like a magazine spread. Richard had arranged himself in his favorite leather armchair, the one he'd brought from his old house when he moved in with us 3 years earlier. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sweater. Tyler and Madison, Richard's twins, sat side by side on the loveseat, both of them wearing matching smirks that made my stomach twist. "Sit down, sweetheart," Mom said, patting the cushion beside her. The photographer stood behind a tripod near the fireplace, adjusting his lens with professional efficiency. Equipment cases and lighting umbrellas cluttered the corner, where our old piano used to sit before Richard decided it took up too much space. The whole scene felt staged, artificial, like we were actors who'd forgotten our lines. "We're doing the family portraits today," Richard announced without looking at me. His voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant his decision was final and not up for discussion. "For the Christmas cards this year." I glanced around the room, counting faces. Tyler sat with his arms crossed, wearing the navy polo shirt Mom had bought him last week. Madison smoothed her burgundy dress, the one that brought out her eyes according to Richard. Mom wore her best blouse, the cream-colored silk one she saved for special occasions. Richard had on his charcoal suit, the expensive one from his promotion celebration. "Okay," I said slowly, still standing near the doorway. "Should I go change? I can put on that green dress you liked." "Actually," Richard interrupted, shifting forward in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. "We've decided to keep this year's cards simple, just the immediate family." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a familiar weight I'd learned to carry but never quite accepted. "Immediate family?" "You understand," he said, finally meeting my eyes. His expression was carefully neutral, practiced. "It's cleaner this way. Less confusing for people who receive the cards." Mom's hands fluttered to her necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed since marrying Richard. "Honey, you know how complicated it can be to explain blended families to everyone." "Complicated," I repeated. The photographer continued setting up his equipment, pretending not to hear the conversation unfolding in front of him. Tyler picked at a loose thread on his shirt. Madison examined her manicure with sudden fascination. "It's just easier," Richard continued, his voice taking on that patronizing edge he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "The Blackwood family Christmas card has always been traditional, clean, professional." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would indicate she remembered I was her daughter. That I'd lived in this house for 3 years, contributed to household chores, helped with grocery shopping, shared countless dinners at that dining room table. That I'd been part of her life for 17 years before Richard ever existed in our world. She avoided my gaze, focusing instead on straightening the throw pillows behind her. "So where exactly am I supposed to be during this family photo session?" I asked. "You could go study," Tyler suggested with false helpfulness. "Didn't you say you had those college essays to finish?" Madison nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, and you're always talking about how important your grades are. This would be perfect timing. The casual cruelty in their voices hit me like a physical blow. They'd planned this. All of them had sat around, probably over breakfast while I was in the shower, and decided that I didn't belong in their picture-perfect family portrait. I see, I said quietly. So I'm good enough to do the dishes and help with Tyler's math homework and drive Madison to her soccer practice when you're busy, but not good enough to stand in a photo. Don't be dramatic, Natalie, Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. This isn't personal. It feels pretty personal from where I'm standing. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mom said softly, still not looking at me. You know how Richard feels about consistency in family traditions. Consistency. As if I was some kind of disruption to their perfect family harmony instead of Carol's daughter, who'd been quietly adapting to their rules and expectations for years. The photographer cleared his throat gently. Folks, I've got everything set up whenever you're ready. Richard stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the air of someone accustomed to having his decisions followed without question. Perfect. Natalie, we shouldn't be more than an hour. An hour. They were giving me an hour's notice to disappear from my own home so they could take pictures that would hang on our walls, sit on our mantel, and get mailed to dozens of relatives and family friends with my face conspicuously absent. Got it? I said, backing toward the staircase. Wouldn't want to contaminate your consistent family tradition. There's no need for sarcasm, Richard called after me, but I was already halfway up the stairs. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, listening to the muffled voices below as they arranged themselves for their perfect portrait. Mom's laugh drifted up again, brighter now that the unpleasant conversation was over. Tyler made some joke that earned chuckles from everyone. The photographer's voice provided gentle direction about positioning and lighting. They sounded happy. Complete. Like they'd been waiting for me to leave so they could finally relax and be themselves. I sank onto my bed and stared at the college application essays scattered across my floor. The prompts blurred together through the sting in my eyes. Describe a challenge you've overcome. Tell us about a time you stood up for something you believed in. What makes you unique? What made me unique was that I was the only person in my family who didn't belong in the family photo. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from my best friend Kayla. "Wanna come over? Mom's making her famous lasagna." I started to type back, then stopped. How do you explain that you've been exiled from your own living room so your stepfamily can commemorate their happiness without you? How do you admit that your own mother chose to erase you rather than risk disappointing her husband? Instead, I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document. If they wanted me to disappear, I'd use the time productively. I started typing my response to the challenge essay prompt, my fingers moving faster as the hurt transformed into something sharper, more focused. The greatest challenge I've faced isn't overcoming failure or dealing with loss, I wrote. It's learning to define my own worth when the people closest to me refuse to see it. Downstairs, I heard the camera shutter clicking repeatedly, capturing moment after moment of the Blackwood family's joy. Each click felt like a small erasure, another confirmation that I was temporary, expendable, tolerated rather than treasured. The rain continued its steady percussion against my window. I wrote for the entire hour, channeling years of accumulated slights and dismissals into essays about resilience, independence, and the difference between fitting in and belonging. By the time I heard the photographer packing up his equipment, I had rough drafts for 3 different applications. The front door opened and closed. Voices carried from the driveway as Richard probably walked the photographer to his car, discussing timeline for the finished photos and additional prints for relatives. I saved my work and ventured downstairs. The living room had been returned to its normal arrangement, but something felt different. The air itself seemed to hold traces of their satisfaction, their relief at having preserved their perfect family image. Mom was in the kitchen, humming while she started dinner preparations. She looked up when I entered, her smile a little too bright, a little too forced. "How did the essays go, honey?" "Fine," I said, opening the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. "Get the shots you wanted?" "They turned out beautifully," she said, her voice carrying that artificial cheer she used when she was trying to convince herself everything was normal. "Richard thinks we'll have them back in time for the Christmas mailing." I nodded, twisting the cap off my water bottle. "That's nice." She moved closer, reaching out to touch my arm. "Natalie, you know we love you, right? This photo thing, it's just business." I finished for her. "I get it, Mom. Family is complicated unless you make it simple." Her hand dropped to her side. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" I took a long drink of water, studying her face. "When do I stop being the complication you have to explain away?" Before she could answer, Richard's voice boomed from the front hallway. "Carol, did you see where I left my reading glasses?" "Kitchen counter," she called back, already moving away from me toward the sound of his voice. Always toward the sound of his voice. I finished my water and headed back upstairs. The college essays could wait. I had a sudden urge to look through my old photo albums, the ones from before Richard entered our lives. The ones where I appeared in every family picture because I actually was family, not just someone who happened to live in the house.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
In my closet, behind winter coats and graduation dresses, I found the cardboard box I'd been meaning to organize for months. Photo albums from elementary school, middle school, family vacations before Mom remarried. Pictures of me and Mom at my 8th grade graduation, both of us grinning at the camera. Images from camping trips, birthday parties, lazy Sunday mornings where we'd make pancakes and read the newspaper together. In every single photo, I belonged completely and without question. I spread the albums across my bed, flipping through pages of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Had I really been that confident once? That certain of my place in the world? The girl in these pictures smiled without reservation. She leaned into hugs instead of holding herself carefully apart. She took up space in family photos because nobody had ever suggested she shouldn't. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Kayla. "Everything okay? You seem off lately." I stared at the message for a long time. Off was an understatement. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, becoming translucent around the edges, until one day I'd be completely invisible. The family photo session wasn't the first time I'd been excluded, just the most obvious. There was the summer barbecue where Richard had introduced Tyler and Madison to his colleagues as my kids, while I stood 3 feet away holding a plate of hamburgers. The parent-teacher conferences where Mom went alone because it might be confusing to have Richard there for someone else's child. The family vacation planning sessions that happened when I was at work, resulting in trips scheduled during my college prep programs. 1,000 small cuts, each one insignificant on its own, adding up to a clear message. I was a guest in my own life. I closed the photo albums and stacked them neatly back in the box. Tomorrow I would focus on my college applications, on building a future where I wouldn't have to ask permission to exist in my own space. Where family photos would include me because I'd choose the family that went in them. But tonight I let myself feel the full weight of being erased. Of watching my mother choose comfort over courage, convenience over connection with her own daughter. The rain kept falling, washing the last autumn leaves from the trees outside my window. Soon it would be winter, then spring, then time for me to leave for college and start over somewhere nobody knew me as the stepdaughter who didn't quite fit. For the first time in months, that future felt like freedom instead of escape. Downstairs, I heard Tyler and Madison arguing over television channels while Richard settled into his evening routine of reading financial reports in his chair. Mom moved through the kitchen, preparing their dinner, probably already mentally composing the Christmas card message that would accompany their perfect family photo. I wondered if they'd notice when I wasn't there to receive a copy. 3 days later, I was reorganizing my backpack between classes when Lucas Rivera approached my locker. We'd been in the same advanced literature class since sophomore year, but had never talked much beyond comparing notes or group project coordination. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who spoke up only when he had something meaningful to contribute. "Hey," he said, leaning against the locker next to mine. "You seemed pretty distracted during the discussion today." I shrugged, pulling out my chemistry textbook. Just tired. Want to grab coffee sometime? That new place downtown has decent espresso and actually quiet corners where you can think. I looked at him more carefully. Lucas had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his dark hair always looked slightly disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it while reading. He wore thrift store sweaters and carried books that weren't assigned reading, poetry collections and philosophy texts that stuck out of his worn canvas messenger bag. "Why?" I asked. "Because you look like someone who needs a friend right now," he said simply. "And because I've been wanting to ask you about that essay you wrote on isolation in contemporary literature." It was brilliant, but it felt personal. Something in his tone made me pause. Not curiosity, not pity, just genuine interest in what I had to say. "Okay," I heard myself saying. "Coffee sounds good." That afternoon, we walked to Harbor Cafe through the gentle Oregon drizzle that seemed to follow me everywhere lately. The cafe was exactly as Lucas had described. Warm, dimly lit, with mismatched furniture and the kind of atmosphere that invited long conversations over slowly cooling drinks. We found a corner table near a rain-streaked window. Lucas ordered black coffee. I chose chamomile tea, hoping it might ease the constant knot in my stomach. So, he said once we were settled, "Tell me about the college essays." I almost choked on my tea. "How did you know about those? You've been writing during lunch breaks for weeks. Plus, you have that particular look of someone wrestling with personal statements and scholarship applications. Observant. Occupational hazard of being an introvert," he said with a slight smile. "We notice things." I found myself telling him about the essay prompts, about trying to write honestly without sounding bitter or damaged. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that showed he was actually processing what I said. "Family stuff is complicated," he said finally. "That's one way to put it." "My dad left when I was 12, Lucas said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "My mom spent 2 years trying to explain to people why we were suddenly a family of 2 instead of 3. Like we'd failed some kind of test." I looked at him with new understanding. Did it get easier? Eventually. But not because the situation changed. Because I stopped expecting other people to validate our family structure. He met my eyes across the table. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect your sense of belonging are the ones who make you question it most. The words hit me with unexpected force. I'd been so focused on trying to earn my place in Richard's version of family that I'd forgotten I already had a place. It just wasn't the one they were offering. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said. I nodded. "What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? If you had unlimited resources and no one else's opinion mattered?" The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so much energy trying to navigate other people's expectations that I'd stopped considering my own wants. "I'd study sustainable agriculture," I said without thinking. "Maybe start a business around organic farming or conservation. Help people grow things that last." That's specific. My grandmother had this property outside town, 12 acres with a vineyard and vegetable gardens. I spent summers there when I was younger, before she got sick. I paused, surprised by how easily the words came. She taught me about soil composition and crop rotation and how to read weather patterns. I've always been good with growing things. "What happened to the property?" "She left it to me in her will. It's been sitting empty for 2 years while I've been dealing with high school and college applications." I traced the rim of my tea mug with one finger. "My stepfather keeps suggesting we sell it. Says it's too much responsibility for someone my age." Lucas was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "But it's yours." "Legally, yes, practically." I shrugged. "I don't know, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility." "Or maybe he doesn't want you to have something that's completely yours," Lucas said gently. The thought hit me like cold water. I'd never considered that Richard's concerns about the property might have more to do with control than practicality. "I should probably check on the place," I said slowly. "It's been months since I've been out there. Want company?" I looked at him across the table, this boy who asked thoughtful questions and listened to actual answers, who seemed genuinely interested in what I thought rather than what I could do for him. "Yeah," I said. I'd like that. The following Saturday, Lucas met me in the school parking lot, where I'd borrowed Mom's car for the afternoon. The drive to Grandmother Maggie's property took us through the winding hills outside Riverside, past farms and vineyards that looked like postcards in the autumn light. I hadn't been to the house since the estate paperwork was finalized 8 months earlier. Richard had handled most of the legal details, explaining that it was too complicated for me to manage while focusing on school. I'd signed the papers he put in front of me, trusting that he was protecting my interests. Now, pulling into the gravel driveway, I wondered what else I'd been too distracted to notice. The Victorian house sat on a small rise overlooking the vineyard, its gingerbread trim painted white against sage-green siding. The wraparound porch sagged slightly in one corner, and several shutters hung at odd angles, but the bones of the structure looked solid. Weeds had overtaken the flower beds, and the vineyard rows needed pruning, but underneath the neglect, I could see the beauty that had made Grandmother Maggie fall in love with this place 40 years earlier. "Wow," Lucas breathed, climbing out of the car. "This is incredible." I fumbled with the key ring, finding the brass key Maggie had pressed into my hand during her final hospital stay. "Promise me you'll take care of it," she'd whispered. "Don't let anyone convince you it's too much. You have good instincts, Natalie. Trust them." The front door opened with a loud creak that echoed through empty rooms. Dust motes danced in afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The hardwood floors needed refinishing, and the wallpaper in the hallway had started peeling near the corners. But the house felt solid, welcoming, like it was waiting patiently for someone to bring it back to life. We wandered through rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets, our footsteps muffled by old carpets. The kitchen had vintage appliances and deep farmhouse sinks. The library contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a window seat that looked out over the vineyard. Upstairs, 5 bedrooms offered views of rolling hills and distant mountains. "Your grandmother had amazing taste," Lucas said, running his hand along a carved banister. "This place has so much character." In the master bedroom, I found a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were photo albums, letters, and documents I'd never seen before. Legal papers, property surveys, tax records dating back decades. At the bottom of the chest, a manila envelope with my name written in Maggie's careful handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter and several official-looking documents. "My dearest Natalie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I've run out of time to tell you these things in person. This property has been in our family for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather built the original farmhouse on this land, and every generation since has added to it, improved it, made it more beautiful. I'm leaving it to you not because you're the oldest grandchild, or because you need it most, but because you're the one who understands what it means to grow things with patience and care. You've always seen potential where others see problems. You've always believed in nurturing what others might give up on. The land is yours completely. No mortgages, no liens, no strings attached. The vineyard produces enough income to cover property taxes and basic maintenance if properly managed. There are also mineral rights and timber rights that provide additional revenue streams. I've included documentation for everything. Don't let anyone tell you this is too much responsibility. You've been responsible for your own emotional well-being for years, while the adults around you figured out their priorities. Managing land and buildings will be easy compared to managing other people's expectations. Trust your instincts, sweetheart. They've never steered you wrong. All my love, Grandmother Maggie. P.S. Check the old oak tree behind the house. I left something there for you. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking. Lucas sat quietly beside me on the window seat, giving me space to process. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew what my home situation was like." The documents were even more surprising. Property appraisals, income statements from the vineyard lease, paperwork showing the land was worth significantly more than I'd realized. According to the most recent assessment, the 12 acres and buildings were valued at over $1 million. "Natalie," Lucas said softly. "This is incredible. You're not just inheriting property, you're inheriting financial independence." We walked outside to find the oak tree Maggie had mentioned. Behind the house, an enormous tree spread its branches over what had once been a children's play area. A rope swing hung from one of the lower branches, its seat weathered but still sturdy. Carved into the bark about 5 feet from the ground were the initials MH plus EK, with a heart around them. Below that, in fresher carving, NH Future Farmer, Lucas laughed. "She really did know you." I traced the letters with my finger, smiling despite the tears threatening to spill over. This place wasn't just an inheritance. It was a message from the one person who'd always seen my potential instead of my problems. As we explored the vineyard rows, I felt something shifting inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what other people expected or needed from me. I was thinking about what I wanted to build, what I wanted to grow, what kind of life I wanted to create. "I could live here," I said out loud, testing how the words sounded. "During college? Maybe instead of college. Or maybe I could commute to Portland Community College for business classes while I learned to manage this place." The ideas came faster now, tumbling over each other in my excitement. I could restore the vineyard, maybe add organic vegetable production. There's space for a farmer's market stand, maybe even agritourism events. Lucas grinned. "You're planning your whole future." "I'm planning my whole life," I corrected. "For the first time, I'm planning something that's completely mine." The drive back to town felt different. I wasn't returning to the Blackwood family home. I was leaving my own property to spend one more night in temporary housing. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with college applications spread in front of me, but my mind kept wandering to business plans and crop rotations. Mom was at her book club meeting, and Richard was working late at the office. Tyler and Madison were upstairs, probably video chatting with friends or working on homework. I opened my laptop and started researching agricultural business programs, sustainable farming practices, small business loans for young entrepreneurs. The information was overwhelming but exciting. I felt like I was finally moving towards something instead of away from something else. When Richard came home around 9 o'clock, he found me surrounded by printouts and notebook pages covered with calculations. "Working hard?" he asked, loosening his tie as he headed for the refrigerator. "Just planning," I said. He grabbed a beer and sat down across from me at the table. "College planning is smart. Have you given any more thought to that community college option we discussed? It would be more affordable, and you could live at home while you figure things out." I looked at him carefully. We'd never discussed community college. He'd mentioned it once as a backup option if I didn't get into any 4-year schools, but it wasn't something we'd explored together. "Actually," I said, "I've been thinking about taking a gap year, maybe focusing on the property grandmother Maggie left me." Richard's expression shifted slightly. "That old place? Natalie, we've talked about this. It's too much for someone your age to handle. The smart thing would be to sell it and use the money for your education. Have we talked about it? Because I don't remember having that conversation." He took a long drink of beer, studying my face. "I've been handling the estate details to protect your interests. Property management is complicated. There are taxes, insurance, maintenance costs. It's a full-time responsibility." "What if I want a full-time responsibility?" "You're 17 years old. You should be thinking about college, career preparation, normal teenage things. Not wrestling with agricultural tax codes and property maintenance." Something in his tone reminded me of the family photo conversation. That same certainty that he knew what was best for me, that same dismissal of my opinions as naive or uninformed. "The property is mine though, right? Legally?" Richard set down his beer bottle with a sharp clink. "Yes, but there are practical considerations." "What practical considerations?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could almost see him calculating how much to tell me. The estate taxes were substantial. I had to take out a loan against the property to cover them. The words hit me like ice water. "You took out a loan against my property?" "I took out a loan to preserve your inheritance," he said, his voice taking on that patient tone adults use when they think teenagers are being unreasonable. Would you rather have lost the entire property to tax seizure? I would rather have been included in the decision about my own inheritance. You were 17 and dealing with senior year stress. I was protecting you from additional pressure. I stared at him across the table, finally understanding why he'd been so involved in the estate paperwork, so eager to handle all the legal details. How much is the loan for? That's not something you need to worry about right now. How much, Richard? He finished his beer before answering. $200,000. The number hung between us like a physical presence. $200,000 against property I'd never agreed to use as collateral. I want to see the paperwork, I said quietly. Natalie, you're getting upset over something that was handled professionally and legally. I have power of attorney for estate matters until you turn 18. Do you? For the first time, Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable. Your mother signed the necessary documents. My mother signed documents giving you power of attorney over my inheritance? To protect your interests while you were still a minor. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers and laptop. I think I need to see those documents. You don't trust that I've been looking out for you? I paused in the doorway, looking back at this man who'd spent 3 years systematically erasing me from family photos and family decisions and now family inheritance. I think, I said carefully, that you've been looking out for yourself. I went to my room and closed the door, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. Everything I discovered that afternoon, the property value, the income potential, the financial independence grandmother Maggie had tried to give me, suddenly felt threatened. I pulled out my phone and searched for estate law attorneys in Portland. If Richard could handle legal details without including me, I could do the same thing. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp clarity that follows sleepless nights spent wrestling with uncomfortable truths. I'd spent hours researching estate law, power of attorney regulations, and property rights, until my eyes burned from screen glare. The information I'd found wasn't encouraging. Richard's claim about having power of attorney wasn't necessarily false, but it also wasn't necessarily legitimate. The documents would need to be examined by someone who understood the legal nuances I was only beginning to grasp. I dressed carefully for school, choosing the navy blazer I'd bought for scholarship interviews and my most professional-looking shoes. If I was going to start acting like an adult, I needed to look like one. Lucas was waiting by my locker when I arrived, holding 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the street. You look like you didn't sleep, he said, handing me one of the cups. I didn't. I took a grateful sip of the bitter coffee. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm naive? Like, genuinely too young or inexperienced to handle adult responsibilities? Lucas studied my face with those thoughtful eyes. I think you've been handling adult responsibilities since you were about 14. I think the people around you have convinced you that your competence is somehow threatening to them. The words settled something inside me that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. Richard took out a loan against my property, $200,000, without telling me. Can he do that legally? I don't know. That's what I need to find out. I closed my locker and leaned against it. I need to talk to a lawyer, but I don't want Richard to know I'm doing it. Not yet. My mom's friend works at a legal aid clinic in Portland, Lucas said. She might be able to point you in the right direction, or at least tell you what questions to ask. Would you come with me? Of course. That afternoon, instead of going to debate club practice, I called in sick and Lucas drove us to Portland in his beat-up Honda. The legal aid clinic occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had seen better decades. But the receptionist was kind and the coffee was free. Diana Martinez, the attorney Lucas's mother had recommended, was younger than I'd expected and wore the slightly frazzled expression of someone juggling too many cases with too few resources. But she listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. How old are you? She asked when I finished. 17, 18 in 3 months. And your stepfather claims to have power of attorney over your inheritance? He says my mother signed documents giving him that authority while I was still a minor. Diana nodded slowly. Power of attorney for minor beneficiaries is complicated. The court typically requires very specific circumstances to grant that kind of authority to someone who isn't the biological parent or legal guardian. Richard isn't my legal guardian. Not unless your mother specifically granted him guardianship through the court system. Marriage alone doesn't automatically confer parental rights over stepchildren. She flipped through her notes. Do you have copies of any of the documents your stepfather has been handling? Number. He's kept everything at his office, says it's safer there. That's a red flag, Diana said bluntly. Beneficiaries have the right to review all estate documents, regardless of age. You should have received copies of everything. She explained that I could request copies of all estate-related documents directly from the court where Grandmother Maggie's will was probated. As the beneficiary, I had legal standing to access that information without anyone's permission. What about the loan he took against the property? If he did that without proper authority, it could constitute financial abuse. But we'd need to see the actual documents to determine whether his actions were legitimate. Diana leaned forward. I have to ask, is there any possibility your stepfather is trying to manipulate the situation for his own benefit? I thought about the family photos, the casual dismissals, the way he'd inserted himself into every decision about my future while excluding me from the conversation. Yes, I said. I think that's exactly what he's doing. Diana gave me a list of documents to request from the court and the contact information for a private attorney who specialized in estate disputes. This is beyond what legal aid can handle, she admitted. But these are the first steps you need to take to protect yourself. The drive back to Riverside was quiet. Lucas didn't push me to talk, just let me process what we'd learned. As we approached the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I felt like I was returning to enemy territory. Want to come over for dinner? Lucas asked as he pulled into the school parking lot where I'd left Mom's car. My mom makes incredible enchiladas, and she's been wanting to meet you. I almost said yes, but something held me back. I should go home, face whatever's waiting for me there. Call me if you need anything, he said. And Natalie, you're doing the right thing. The house was unusually quiet when I walked in. Mom's car was in the driveway, but I didn't hear the usual sounds of dinner preparation or evening news. I found her in the living room, sitting in Richard's chair with a manila folder open on her lap. Hi, honey, she said without looking up. How was school? Fine. I hung my backpack on the stair railing. Where is everyone? Richard took Tyler and Madison out for pizza, some kind of celebration for Madison's soccer tournament win. She finally met my eyes. We need to talk. The folder on her lap contained what looked like legal documents. My stomach clenched with anticipation. Richard told me about your conversation last night, she said. About the property and the loan. I sat down on the sofa, keeping my expression carefully neutral. What did he tell you? That you're upset about the financial arrangements for your inheritance. Mom's voice had that forced calm she used when she was trying to avoid conflict. I think there might be some misunderstanding about what happened. What kind of misunderstanding? She pulled a document from the folder and handed it to me. This is the power of attorney agreement I signed when Maggie's estate was being settled. Richard was trying to protect you from having to deal with complicated legal issues while you were grieving and focusing on school. I read through the document slowly. The language was dense, full of legal terminology I didn't completely understand, but certain phrases stood out. Temporary guardianship for estate purposes. Authority to make financial decisions in the minor's best interest. Valid until beneficiary reaches age of majority. This says temporary guardianship, I said. When was this signed? About 6 months after Maggie passed away. You were struggling so much with the loss, and the estate attorneys said there were time-sensitive decisions that needed to be made. I read the document again, more carefully this time. The signature at the bottom looked like my mother's handwriting, but something about it seemed off. The date was from over a year ago, when I was still 16. I don't remember you discussing this with me. You were in such a difficult place emotionally. Richard and I decided it would be better to handle the legal complexities ourselves until you were ready. Without asking what I wanted? Mom shifted uncomfortably in the chair. We thought we were protecting you. From what? From having a say in my own inheritance? From additional stress during an already difficult time. I set the document down on the coffee table between us. What about now? I'm almost 18, I'm getting ready for college, I'm obviously capable of handling stress. Why is Richard still making decisions about property that belongs to me? Because real estate management is complicated, Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. There are ongoing expenses, tax implications, maintenance issues. It's not something you can learn overnight. But it is something I can learn if someone teaches me instead of hiding it from me. We sat in silence for a moment. I could hear the kitchen clock ticking and the distant sound of traffic on our street. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a normal house where normal families had normal conversations about normal things. This wasn't normal, though. Nothing about this conversation was normal. Mom, I said quietly, do you remember the Christmas photo session last week? She looked down at her hands. What about it? Do you remember how it felt to watch Richard exclude me from the family portrait? That wasn't. It was just easier. It was easier to erase me than to explain that I belong here too. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. This feels like the same thing, I continued. It's easier to let Richard handle my inheritance than to include me in decisions about my own future. That's not what we're doing, isn't it? I picked up the power of attorney document again. This gives him authority to make financial decisions in my best interest. Who decides what my best interest is? The court appointed him as temporary guardian. Did they? Or did you and Richard tell the court that I needed a guardian, and they approved based on your representation of the situation? Mom was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Richard said it was the responsible thing to do. Richard said. I repeated the words slowly. What did you say? I said whatever would be best for you, without asking me what I thought would be best for me. The front door opened, and I heard Tyler and Madison's voices in the hallway, laughing about something that had happened at dinner. Richard's voice joined theirs, warm and paternal in a way I'd never heard him speak to me. They're back, Mom said unnecessarily. I stood up, taking the power of attorney document with me. I'm going to keep this. I want to have a lawyer review it. Natalie, I don't think that's necessary. I think it's extremely necessary. Richard appeared in the living room doorway, loosening his tie with the satisfied expression of someone who'd enjoyed a successful evening out with his children. How was dinner? Mom asked, her voice overly bright. Great. Madison scored 2 goals in the tournament finals. We had to celebrate. He noticed the documents scattered on the coffee table and the tension in the room. Everything okay in here? Natalie has some questions about the estate arrangements, Mom said carefully. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. What kind of questions? I held up the power of attorney document. I'd like to understand exactly what authority this gives you over my inheritance. We discussed this last night. I've been protecting your interests while you focus on school. Right. But I'd like to have an independent lawyer review the documents to make sure I understand my rights and responsibilities. The room went very quiet. Tyler and Madison had stopped talking in the hallway, probably sensing the tension. That seems unnecessary, Richard said finally, and expensive. Legal consultations aren't cheap. I'm willing to pay for it. With what money? It was a fair question. I didn't have significant savings, and my part-time job at the bookstore barely covered gas and personal expenses. I'll figure it out, I said. Richard sat down in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Natalie, I understand that you're feeling left out of important decisions. That wasn't our intention. But hiring lawyers to second-guess arrangements that were made legally and in your best interest seems like a waste of resources that could be better spent on your education. Maybe that should be my decision to make. When you turn 18, it will be. In 3 months. Yes. I looked between him and my mother, both of them watching me with expressions that somehow managed to be both concerned and patronizing. Fine, I said. I can wait 3 months. I went upstairs, leaving them to discuss whatever they needed to discuss without me. In my room, I spread the power of attorney document across my desk and photographed every page with my phone. Then I searched online for information about a state law in Oregon, property rights for minors, and the process for challenging legal guardianship arrangements. What I found wasn't encouraging. Richard's authority appeared to be legitimate, at least on paper. But several websites mentioned that beneficiaries could request court review of guardian decisions if they believed their interests weren't being properly represented. I was still reading when my phone buzzed with a text from Lucas. How did it go at home? Complicated. Can you meet me at the library tomorrow after school? I need help researching something. Of course. Everything okay? I stared at the question for a long time before typing back. I think I'm about to find out. The next few weeks passed in a strange state of suspended animation. I went to classes, worked on college applications, and maintained the appearance of normal teenage life while quietly building a case for my own independence. Lucas helped me research property law, estate regulations, and financial management. We spent hours in the library, surrounded by law books and printouts from legal websites, trying to understand the complex web of rules governing my situation. What we discovered was troubling. The loan Richard had taken against my property wasn't necessarily illegal, but it also wasn't clearly in my best interest. The terms were unfavorable, with a high interest rate and a balloon payment due in 5 years. More concerning, the loan documents included provisions that would allow the lender to claim ownership of the property if payments were missed. This doesn't make sense, Lucas said, reading through the loan paperwork I'd finally managed to access through public records. Why would someone take out a high-interest loan against property that's generating income? Your grandmother's vineyard lease agreement shows steady revenue. Maybe he needed the money for something else. Or maybe he's planning to let the loan default so the lender can claim the property. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made a sick kind of sense. If Richard couldn't control my inheritance directly, he might be setting up a situation where I'd lose it entirely. I started keeping detailed records of every conversation about the property, every document I could access, every interaction that suggested Richard's motives weren't aligned with my interests. I also began researching colleges with strong agricultural programs, business schools that offered real estate and property management courses, anything that would give me the knowledge I needed to protect what was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was working harder to preserve my inheritance than I'd ever worked on anything in my life, while the people who claimed to be protecting it seemed determined to complicate every aspect of its management. At home, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Richard's patience with my questions about the property wore thin, and Mom retreated into a kind of anxious neutrality that satisfied no one. Tyler and Madison seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, but they also began treating me with a new kind of distance, as if I'd become unpredictable or potentially problematic. The family photo situation became a metaphor for everything else. The Christmas cards had been printed and mailed, featuring the 4 of them in perfect holiday harmony while I remained invisible to everyone who received them. Relatives called to ask how the Blackwood family was doing, never mentioning me specifically because they'd forgotten I existed. I started declining invitations to family gatherings, partly because I wasn't included in the planning, and partly because I was tired of being the only person who seemed to notice my own absence. 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, Diana Martinez called with an update. She'd been researching my case during her spare time, and she'd found some concerning information about the power of attorney arrangement. The court records show that your stepfather petitioned for temporary guardianship without standard notification procedures, she said during our phone conversation. You should have been appointed a guardian ad litem to represent your interests during the proceedings. What does that mean? It means the court may not have had complete information when they granted the guardianship. There are grounds to challenge the arrangement, especially now that you're almost 18. She recommended I contact the estate attorney she'd mentioned during our first meeting. James Chen specialized in cases where minor beneficiaries had been taken advantage of by adult relatives or guardians. The consultation will cost money, Diana warned, but given the value of your inheritance, it's probably a worthwhile investment. I made the appointment for the week before my birthday, telling my family I had a college interview in Portland. Lucas offered to drive me, but I decided to take the bus. This was something I needed to do alone. James Chen's office occupied the top floor of a glass building in downtown Portland, with views of the Willamette River and Mount Hood in the distance. He was younger than Richard, but carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to handling complicated family disputes. "Tell me about your relationship with your stepfather," he said after I'd explained the basic situation. I found myself describing years of small dismissals, casual exclusions, and gradual erosion of my place in my own family. The family photos were just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been building since Richard entered our lives. "Has he ever shown interest in your inheritance before the loan situation?" "He's always said it was too complicated for me to handle. That I should focus on being a normal teenager instead of worrying about adult responsibilities. But he's been managing those adult responsibilities without your input." "Yes." James took notes while I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me see patterns I hadn't recognized before. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, reviewing his notes. "Based on what you've told me," he said finally, "I believe you have grounds to challenge both the guardianship arrangement and the loan your stepfather secured against your property." "What would that involve?" "First, we'd petition the court to review the original guardianship order. If we can demonstrate that proper procedures weren't followed, or that your stepfather has acted outside your best interests, we can have the arrangement dissolved." "And the loan?" "If the loan was secured without proper authority, we can potentially have it declared invalid. That would require the lender to return any money already disbursed and remove the lien against your property. The legal fees would be substantial, but James offered to work on a contingency basis, taking payment from any settlement or recovery we achieved. "There's one more thing you should know," he said as our meeting concluded. "Given the value of your inheritance and the questionable circumstances surrounding its management, this case could attract media attention. Family disputes involving significant property often do. Would that be bad?" "Not necessarily. Sometimes public attention helps ensure that all parties act ethically. But it would mean your family situation becomes public knowledge." I thought about Richard's concern for his professional reputation, his carefully maintained image as a successful family man. The idea of that image being examined publicly was both terrifying and satisfying. How quickly could we move forward? "Once you turn 18, we can file immediately. But I'd recommend preparing everything beforehand, so we're ready to act as soon as you're legally an adult." The bus ride back to Riverside gave me time to process what I'd learned. In less than a week, I'd have the legal standing to challenge everything Richard had done in my name. I'd also have the responsibility of managing whatever consequences that challenge might bring. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of just enduring whatever decisions other people made for me. The feeling lasted until I walked into the house and found my entire family gathered in the living room, watching me with expressions that ranged from concerned to accusatory. "Sit down, Natalie," Richard said. "We need to talk." Richard had positioned himself in his usual chair, but his posture was different tonight. Instead of his typical relaxed evening stance, he sat forward with his elbows on his knees, fingers steepled in front of his face. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa like she might need to flee at any moment. Tyler and Madison flanked her on either side, their usual casual demeanor replaced by something more formal, more rehearsed. "Where were you today?" Richard asked without preamble. I hung my backpack on the stair railing, buying myself a few seconds to think. "Portland. I told you I had a college interview." "Which college?" The question was sharp, direct. Not the kind of follow-up a supportive stepfather would ask about an exciting opportunity, but the kind an interrogator would use to test a suspect's story. "Portland State," I said, choosing the first name that came to mind. "For their business program." "Funny thing," Richard continued, his voice taking on that dangerous calm I'd learned to recognize. "I called Portland State this afternoon to ask about their interview schedule. They don't conduct admissions interviews." The room fell completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the tick of the mantel clock that had belonged to my father. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed loud enough for everyone to hear. "I see," I said carefully. "Do you?" Richard stood up, smoothing his slacks with the deliberate movements of someone trying to control their temper. "Because I'm starting to think you've been lying to us about a lot of things lately." Mom shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Richard, maybe we should. No, Carol. We've been patient long enough. He turned back to me. Sit down, Natalie. We're going to clear the air about a few things. I remained standing near the staircase, one hand resting on the banister. Something about his tone, about the way Tyler and Madison were watching me with barely concealed anticipation, made me reluctant to move further into the room. I'm fine standing. I said, sit down. The command carried the kind of authority Richard used in his professional life, the voice of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. For a moment, I almost complied out of habit. Then I remembered James Chen's office, the view of Mount Hood through floor-to-ceiling windows, the legal documents that proved I wasn't imagining the manipulation I'd been experiencing for years. No, I said quietly. Richard's face flushed slightly. Excuse me? I said no, I don't want to sit down. Tyler smirked from his position on the sofa. She's getting an attitude. She's been getting an attitude for weeks, Madison added. Ever since she started asking all those questions about Grandma Maggie's house. Richard nodded, as if they'd confirmed something he'd suspected. That's exactly what we need to discuss. Natalie, your recent behavior has been concerning. The secretiveness, the questions about legal arrangements you don't understand, the apparent lies about your activities. My behavior has been concerning? Yes. You've been acting like you don't trust the people who care about you most. I almost laughed at the irony. Maybe because the people who claim to care about me most have been making major decisions about my life without including me in the conversation. We've been protecting you. You've been controlling me. Richard's jaw tightened. That's enough. You're still a minor living in this house, and you'll show respect for the adults who've been looking out for your best interests. Looking out for my best interests by taking out a $200,000 loan against property that belongs to me? Mom made a small sound of distress. Tyler and Madison exchanged glances that suggested this conversation was going exactly as they'd expected. That loan, Richard said slowly, was necessary to cover estate taxes and legal fees. Would you rather have lost the entire property? I'd rather have been consulted before someone used my inheritance as collateral for a loan I knew nothing about. You were 16 years old and grieving. You weren't capable of making complex financial decisions. But I'm capable of living with the consequences of your complex financial decisions. Richard moved closer, and I instinctively stepped back toward the stairs. Something in his expression had shifted from paternal frustration to something harder, more calculating. Let me explain something to you, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous calm again. That property is a burden you're not equipped to handle. The vineyard lease expires next year, and the tenants aren't interested in renewing. The house needs substantial repairs that will cost more than you could possibly afford. The property taxes alone would drain any savings you might have. How do you know the tenants aren't renewing? Richard paused for just a fraction of a second. I've been in communication with them about the lease terms. You've been negotiating my lease agreements without telling me? I've been managing the property so you don't have to worry about it. Or so I don't have any say in what happens to it. Mom finally spoke up, her voice strained. Natalie, sweetheart, Richard has been working so hard to handle all these complicated issues. Maybe you could show a little gratitude instead of suspicion. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd raised me for 17 years before Richard entered our lives. The woman who'd taught me to stand up for myself, to question authority when something didn't feel right, to trust my instincts about people's motivations. Mom, I said softly, do you remember what you used to tell me about listening to my gut feelings about people? Her face crumpled slightly. That's different. Is it? Richard stepped between us, literally blocking my view of my mother. Enough. This conversation is over. You're grounded until further notice, and you'll hand over your phone and car keys. I'm 18 in 5 days. Until then, you live by our rules. Your rules. I corrected. These aren't Mom's rules. These are your rules. Carol agrees with me, don't you, Carol? All eyes turned to my mother. She looked smaller than usual, hunched into herself like she was trying to disappear. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I just want what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I said. Or what's easiest for Richard? Tyler stood up abruptly. God, you're so dramatic. Richard's been taking care of you for years, and all you do is complain about it. Taking care of me how? By excluding me from family photos? By making decisions about my inheritance without my input? By lying about my property management? He hasn't been lying, Madison said. He's been protecting you from stuff you're too immature to handle. I'm too immature to handle my own inheritance, but Tyler's mature enough to have opinions about how it should be managed? Tyler isn't the one questioning everything and acting like we're all out to get him, Richard said. Maybe Tyler doesn't need to question anything because Tyler isn't the one being systematically excluded from this family. The words hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what they were. Richard's expression shifted again, and for a moment I saw something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if I'd finally said what he'd been waiting for me to say. Is that what you think? He asked. That you're being excluded? I think I've been excluded since the day you moved into this house. I think you've spent 3 years gradually erasing me from this family, and now you're trying to erase me from my own inheritance. That's ridiculous. Is it? When was the last time you introduced me as your stepdaughter instead of just Carol's daughter? When was the last time I was included in a family decision without having to fight for it? When was the last time you acted like my presence here was something you wanted instead of something you tolerated? Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more menacing. You know what I think, Natalie? I think you've been looking for reasons to feel sorry for yourself. I think you've built up this fantasy where you're the victim and everyone else is the villain, because it's easier than taking responsibility for your own attitude and behavior. My attitude and behavior. Quote, yes. You've been sullen and uncooperative since the day I married your mother. You've resented every attempt I've made to be a father figure to you. You've made it clear that you don't consider Tyler and Madison your real siblings. And you've never made an effort to be part of this family. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, because there was just enough truth in it to make me doubt myself. I had been resentful, I had kept my distance, I had protected myself by not fully investing in relationships that felt precarious and conditional. But that didn't mean I was wrong about everything else. Maybe I've been protecting myself, I said. Maybe I learned early on that my place in this family was conditional and could be revoked at any time. Your place in this family is what you make it. My place in this family is what you allow it to be. We stared at each other across the living room, and I realized that this conversation had been building for 3 years. All the small slights, all the casual dismissals, all the decisions made without my input had been leading to this moment where we finally acknowledged what we both knew. I didn't belong here. I never had. And Richard had been systematically ensuring that I never would. Fine, I said finally. You want me to take responsibility for my attitude? I'll take responsibility for it. I've been resentful and uncooperative because I've been treated like a guest in my own home. I've kept my distance because every time I tried to get closer, I was reminded that I wasn't really part of the family. That's not true, Mom said weakly, but she couldn't meet my eyes. When was the last time you defended me, Mom? When was the last time you chose my feelings over Richard's convenience? The silence that followed was answer enough. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the family portraits on the mantel that didn't include me, the Christmas decorations I hadn't been consulted about, the furniture arrangement that had no space designated as mine. I'm going to my room, I said. I have some phone calls to make. You're not making any phone calls, Richard said. Hand over your phone. No, this isn't a negotiation. You're right, it's not. I started up the stairs. It's me telling you that I'm done pretending this arrangement works for any of us. If you go up those stairs without handing over that phone, you'll find yourself looking for somewhere else to live. Richard called after me. I paused halfway up the staircase and turned back to look at him. Is that a threat or a promise? It's a consequence. I nodded slowly. Good to know where we stand. I continued up to my room and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, but not from fear. From rage. From the kind of clean, focused anger that comes when someone finally shows you exactly who they are. I dialed Lucas's number. "Hey," he answered on the second ring. "How did the lawyer meeting go?" "It went well. But I think I'm about to be homeless." "What happened?" I gave him a quick summary of the confrontation downstairs, the threats, the ultimatum about my phone, and the implicit threat about my living situation. "Can you pick me up?" I asked. "Of course. Where do you want to go?" "I need to see my property. I need to remember what I'm fighting for." An hour later, Lucas and I stood on the wraparound porch of Grandmother Maggie's house, watching the sunset paint the vineyard in shades of gold and amber. I'd packed a single bag with essentials, left it in Lucas's car, and decided that if Richard wanted me out of his house, I'd accommodate him. "You can't actually live here yet," Lucas said gently. "There's no heat, no running water, no electricity." "I know. But I can spend the night here. I can think clearly here." "And then what?" "Then I turn 18 in 4 days, and I take control of everything that's actually mine." We spread a blanket on the living room floor and ate sandwiches Lucas had picked up on the way. The house felt different at night, full of shadows and memories and possibilities. Without the noise of other people's expectations, I could finally hear my own thoughts. "Are you scared?" Lucas asked. "Terrified, but also relieved." I leaned back against the wall, looking up at the ceiling with its ornate plaster medallions. I've been so focused on trying to fit into their version of family that I forgot I could build my own version. What does your version look like? I thought about it for a long time. Smaller, more honest, full of people who actually want me there. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Please come home. We can work this out." I showed Lucas the message. "What do you think?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But I also think you should be prepared for them to escalate things when you don't come back." He was right. Richard wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and I'd just challenged his authority in front of his children and my mother. He'd need to reassert control somehow. I texted back, "I'm safe. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk." Then I turned off my phone. That night, wrapped in sleeping bags Lucas had borrowed from his camping gear, we talked about everything and nothing. About books we'd loved, places we wanted to travel, careers we might want to pursue, about the difference between family by blood and family by choice. "My mom's going to love you," Lucas said as we were falling asleep. "How do you know?" "Because you're exactly the kind of person she raised me to recognize. Someone who stands up for what's right even when it's hard." I woke up before dawn, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar ceiling and the silence that comes with being miles from traffic and neighbors. Then I remembered where I was and why, and the events of the previous evening came flooding back. Lucas was still asleep, curled up in his sleeping bag like a question mark. I slipped outside onto the porch and watched the sun come up over the hills that would soon be mine to protect or destroy as I saw fit. My phone showed 17 missed calls from home and a dozen text messages ranging from concerned to angry to threatening. The most recent one, sent at 2 in the morning, was from Richard. "You have 24 hours to come home and apologize, or we're filing a missing person report." I almost laughed, as if I was missing instead of exactly where I chose to be. I called James Chen's office and left a voicemail explaining that my timeline had accelerated, that I needed to move forward with challenging the guardianship arrangement as soon as I turned 18. Then I called Deanna Martinez at the legal aid clinic. "Natalie?" she answered, sounding surprised to hear from me so early. "I need to ask you about something. If someone threatens to file a false missing person report because you won't come home, is that illegal?" "That depends. Are you actually missing?" "Number, I'm staying at property I own, with a friend my family knows about, but they're threatening to report me missing if I don't come home and apologize for questioning their authority." Diana was quiet for a moment. "How old are you again?" 17. 18 in 4 days. "And where are you staying?" "The property I inherited from my grandmother. It's not livable yet, but it's safe." "Natalie, I need to be clear about something. Until you're 18, your stepfather does have legal authority to determine where you live. If he files a missing person report, the police will bring you home. Even if I'm not actually missing? Even if you're exactly where you want to be." I absorbed this information, feeling the brief hope of the morning deflate. "So I have to go back." Or you have to stay hidden until your birthday. Hidden. Not at your property. Somewhere they can't find you. I thought about Lucas's offer to have me meet his mother, about the warmth in his voice when he talked about his family, about the possibility that somewhere in the world were adults who actually wanted to help teenagers instead of control them. I might have an option, I said. Be careful, Natalie, and call me if you need anything. I hung up and went back inside to find Lucas awake and folding his sleeping bag. Everything okay? He asked. I need to ask you a huge favor. Anything. Can I hide at your house for 4 days? Lucas grinned. My mom's been hoping I'd ask that question. 2 hours later, I was sitting at Elena Rivera's kitchen table, drinking coffee that actually tasted good, and eating homemade breakfast burritos, while she explained why she'd raised Lucas to recognize people who needed sanctuary. I was 17 when I left my father's house, she said, refilling my coffee mug. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of needing to choose between safety and truth. Elena was everything my mother might have been, if she'd never learned to be afraid of other people's displeasure. She asked direct questions and listened to the actual answers. She offered practical help without trying to manage my emotions. She treated my situation as serious without making me feel like a burden. You can stay as long as you need, she said. But we should probably call your mother and let her know you're safe. What if they try to force me to come home? Then we'll figure out how to handle that when it happens. I called my mother's cell phone, not the house line. I didn't want to deal with Richard right now. Natalie? Mom's voice was strained, exhausted. Where are you? I'm safe. I'm staying with a friend's family. You need to come home. Richard is furious, and he's talking about involving the police. I'm not missing, Mom. I'm exactly where I choose to be. You're still a minor. For 4 more days. Richard says if you don't come home by tonight, he's going to file a runaway report. I looked across the kitchen at Elena, who was pretending not to listen while she cleaned counters that were already spotless. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you decided to marry Richard, did you discuss how he would treat me? Did you talk about what my place would be in the new family structure? Mom was quiet for a long time. We talked about blending our families, yes. What did that conversation look like? We agreed that it would take time for everyone to adjust. Did you agree that I would gradually become less important, as Tyler and Madison became more important? That's not what happened. Isn't it? Can you honestly tell me that my relationship with you hasn't changed since you married Richard? Another long silence. When Mom spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Everything changed when I married Richard. That was the point. We were building a new family. Were we building it together, or was I just expected to fit into the family he wanted? I don't know how to answer that. I think you just did. I heard Richard's voice in the background, demanding to know who was on the phone. I have to go, Mom said quickly. But Natalie, please think about coming home. We can work this out. I have been thinking about it, Mom, for 3 years. And I've decided that some things can't be worked out. Some things are just broken. I hung up before she could respond. Elena sat down across from me at the table. That sounded difficult. It was honest. Finally. Sometimes honesty is the hardest thing we can offer the people we love. That afternoon, Lucas and I drove into Portland to meet with James Chen. I wanted everything in place so I could move forward the moment I turned 18. Your situation has become more urgent, James said after I explained the events of the previous evening. If your stepfather is threatening to involve law enforcement, he's trying to establish a pattern of authority that will be harder to challenge later. What does that mean? It means we need to be prepared to act immediately when you turn 18. And it means we should probably prepare for him to escalate his tactics when he realizes he's losing control. James had drawn up preliminary paperwork to challenge the guardianship arrangement, request a full audit of the estate management, and demand immediate transfer of all property-related documents and accounts to my control. This is going to be expensive, he warned, and it's going to be public. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the family photos that didn't include me. The Christmas cards that had been mailed to dozens of relatives without my image. The years of being treated like a temporary resident in my own life. "I'm prepared to fight for what's mine," I said. "Even if it means permanently damaging your relationship with your family?" "My relationship with my family has been permanently damaged for years. I'm just finally ready to stop pretending otherwise." That evening, Elena made dinner for the three of us, and we sat around their small dining table like an actual family. Lucas told stories about his classes, Elena shared updates from her work at the community health clinic, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. "This is what it should feel like," I said without thinking. "What should feel like?" Elena asked. "Family dinner. People actually wanting to hear what you have to say, instead of just waiting for you to stop talking." Elena and Lucas exchanged a look that made me realize I'd probably revealed more about my home situation than I'd intended. "Family isn't just the people you're related to," Elena said gently. "It's the people who choose to love you exactly as you are." That night, lying on the pull-out couch in Lucas's living room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of people who wanted me to be exactly who I was, instead of some version of myself that would be more convenient for them. 3 more days until I could take control of my own life. 3 more days until I could stop asking permission to exist in my own space. I was counting down to freedom, but I was also counting down to a war. One wasn't sure I was ready to fight. My 18th birthday arrived on a Tuesday morning with the kind of crisp, November clarity that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I woke up on Elena's pull-out couch, feeling like I was finally inhabiting my own life instead of borrowing someone else's. Lucas had already left for school, but Elena was in the kitchen making pancakes shaped like the number 18. It was such a simple gesture, so different from the elaborate birthday productions Richard orchestrated for Tyler and Madison, but it felt more genuine than any celebration I'd experienced in years. "Happy birthday, mija," Elena said, sliding a plate across the counter. "How does it feel to be an adult?" "Terrifying and liberating at the same time." "That sounds about right." My phone had been buzzing since 6 in the morning with messages from classmates, a few distant relatives who'd remembered my birthday, and one text from my mother that simply said, "Happy birthday, honey. I love you." Nothing from Richard, Tyler, or Madison. Not that I'd expected anything. At exactly 9 o'clock, I called James Chen's office. "Ready to file?" he asked without preamble. "Ready. I'll have the paperwork submitted within the hour. Once it's filed, your stepfather will be served with notice that his guardianship authority has been challenged, and that all decisions regarding your inheritance are frozen pending court review." "How long before we get a hearing?" 2 to 3 weeks, typically. But given the value of the assets involved, and the nature of the allegations, the court might expedite things. "What should I expect from Richard when he gets served?" James was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, people who've been using legal authority to control others don't give up that control gracefully. He'll probably try to convince you to drop the challenge, maybe offer compromises that sound reasonable but don't actually address the underlying issues. And if that doesn't work, then he'll try to discredit your claims by attacking your character, your judgment, your motives. Be prepared for that." I thanked James and hung up, feeling a mixture of excitement and dread. The legal battle was finally beginning, but I had no illusions about how ugly it might get. Elena had to work that afternoon, so Lucas picked me up from his house and drove me to Grandmother Maggie's property. I wanted to spend my first day as an adult walking the land that would soon be entirely under my control. The vineyard looked different in late autumn, with the vines dormant and the rolling hills covered in golden grass. We hiked through the rows, and I tried to imagine what this place would look like in spring when everything came back to life. "Have you thought about what you want to do with it?" Lucas asked as we reached the highest point on the property, where an old oak tree provided a view of the entire 12 acres. "I want to restore the vineyard, obviously. But I also want to add sustainable farming practices, maybe organic certification. There's space for vegetable gardens, maybe a farm stand at the front of the property." "Sounds like you've given it a lot of thought." "I've had a lot of time to think lately." We sat under the oak tree, and I pulled out my phone to check for updates from James. No new messages, but that was probably good news. Legal proceedings moved slowly, which meant everything was proceeding normally. "Can I ask you something?" Lucas said. "Always. Are you prepared for the possibility that your family might never forgive you for this?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. The answer was complicated and painful. "I don't think they'll need to forgive me," I said finally. "I think they'll be relieved. Richard gets to be the head of his perfect nuclear family without the complication of a stepdaughter who doesn't quite fit. Tyler and Madison get their father's full attention without having to share it with someone who was never really their sister anyway. And Mom gets to have the peaceful household Richard always wanted. That's not the same as forgiveness. No, it's not. But maybe it's better. Maybe we all get to stop pretending this arrangement ever worked." Lucas was quiet for a while, pulling up handfuls of grass and letting them fall through his fingers. "My dad left when I was 12, he said finally. "For a long time I thought it was my fault. Like if I'd been a better son, a more interesting kid, he would have stayed." "Do you still think that?" No, I think some people just aren't equipped to love anyone besides themselves. And sometimes the kindest thing they can do is leave, instead of continuing to damage everyone around them. I understood what he was trying to tell me. That Richard's inability to see me as part of his family wasn't a reflection of my worth, but of his limitations. That the family's willingness to exclude me, rather than deal with Richard's discomfort, said more about them than it did about me. It was a comforting thought, but it didn't make the loss hurt any less. Around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. Mom's number. "Hi," I answered cautiously. "Natalie." Her voice sounded strained, carefully controlled. "Can you come home? We need to talk." "What about?" "Richard received some papers today. From a lawyer." So it had begun. I'm sure he did. "Can you please just come home so we can discuss this like a family?" "Mom, we haven't discussed anything like a family for 3 years. Why start now?" "Because this is serious. Richard says you're trying to steal property that doesn't belong to you." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'm trying to steal my own inheritance? "He says the property was placed in trust for your benefit, but that you're too young to manage it responsibly. He says this lawsuit could result in you losing everything." I looked out over the vineyard that stretched below us, the house that had belonged to 4 generations of my family, the land that Grandmother Maggie had specifically left to me because she trusted my judgment more than anyone else's. "Mom, do you remember what Grandmother Maggie said to you before she died? About why she was leaving the property to me? She said you understood the value of growing things. She said I understood the value of growing things that last. She said I had the patience to nurture what other people might give up on. That doesn't mean you're ready to manage a complex estate." According to who? According to the man who's been making decisions about my inheritance without consulting me for over a year? According to the man who's been protecting your interests while you focused on being a teenager? I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar frustration of trying to explain something to someone who'd already decided not to understand. "Mom, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Do you trust my judgment?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, when I tell you that something feels wrong, do you believe me? When I say that Richard has been excluding me from this family, do you think I'm telling the truth?" Mom was quiet for a long time. "I think you're hurting, and hurt people sometimes see things differently than they actually are. Or maybe hurt people see things more clearly because they can't afford to lie to themselves." "Natalie, please. Just come home. Let's sit down together and figure out how to resolve this without lawyers and court battles." "What would that look like?" "Richard thinks, if you withdraw the lawsuit, he can work with the estate attorney to establish a more formal structure for managing the property until you're ready to take full responsibility." "Until I'm ready, according to who?" "Until you're older, more established, have some experience with financial management." "How much older, how much experience would be enough?" Mom didn't answer, which was answer enough. "He's never going to think I'm ready, is he?" I said. "There's never going to be a point where Richard decides I'm capable of managing my own inheritance." "That's not true." "Isn't it? When I was 16, I was too young. Now I'm 18 and still too young." When I'm 25, I'll be too inexperienced. When I'm 30, I'll be too emotional. There will always be a reason why Richard knows better than I do about what's best for me. You're being dramatic. I'm being realistic. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking with anger and frustration, and the terrible clarity that comes with finally understanding how completely you've been manipulated. Lucas reached over and took my hand. You okay? Number. But I'm right. And sometimes being right is more important than being okay. That evening, Elena made a birthday dinner with all my favorite foods that she'd somehow learned by paying attention to my casual comments over the past few days. It was the first birthday meal in years where I felt genuinely celebrated instead of simply acknowledged. Any word from your family about the legal papers? Elena asked as we cleared the dishes. My mother called. She wants me to drop the lawsuit and trust Richard to eventually give me control of my own property. What did you tell her? I told her the truth. That he's never going to voluntarily give up control of something that gives him power over me. Elena nodded thoughtfully. When I left my father's house, my mother begged me to come back. She said we could work things out, that I was being too hasty, that family problems should be solved within the family. What did you do? I asked her if she'd ever successfully worked anything out with my father, or if she'd just learned to accept whatever he decided was best. She couldn't answer that question. Did she ever forgive you? Eventually. But it took years, and it took her recognizing that I'd been right about things she didn't want to see. I went to bed that night feeling cautiously hopeful. The legal process was in motion. I had a support system that actually supported me. And for the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what other people expected. But I also knew Richard well enough to know he wouldn't give up easily. I was right. The next morning, Elena woke me up early with a concerned expression and a cup of coffee. There are some people here to see you, she said gently. I looked out the living room window and saw a police car in the driveway. My heart sank. They're not here to arrest you, Elena said quickly, but Richard filed a complaint claiming you've been manipulated by adults who are taking advantage of your grief and inexperience. Are you kidding me? I wish I were. The two officers were professional but clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They explained that they'd received a complaint about a vulnerable young adult being exploited by people seeking to gain access to her inheritance. We're required to follow up on reports like this, the older officer said. But, from what we can see, you appear to be staying here voluntarily with family friends. I am. And you're 18 as of yesterday? Yes. Then there's not much we can do beyond confirming that you're safe and making your own decisions. They asked a few more questions about my living situation, my relationship with Elena and Lucas, and my understanding of the legal proceedings I'd initiated. I answered everything honestly, and it was clear they could see the situation for what it was. Your stepfather seems very concerned about your welfare, the younger officer said diplomatically. My stepfather is concerned about losing control of my inheritance, I replied. The officers exchanged a look. They'd obviously dealt with family disputes before and could recognize manipulation when they saw it. After they left, Elena sat down beside me on the couch. You okay? I'm furious. But I'm also impressed by how far Richard is willing to go to maintain control. What do you mean? I mean, he's not just going to fight me in court. He's going to try to make me look unstable, vulnerable, easily manipulated. He's going to attack my character and my judgment and my right to make decisions about my own life. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the family photos that didn't include me, the years of being treated like a temporary inconvenience, the systematic exclusion from decisions about my own future. I've been preparing for it my whole life, I said. I just didn't know it. That afternoon, James Chen called with an update. The court has expedited your hearing, he said. We'll be in front of a judge next Tuesday. That's fast. Your stepfather's attorney requested the expedited timeline. They're arguing that every day the property remains in dispute, you're at risk of making irreversible financial mistakes. What kind of mistakes? According to their filing, you're planning to break the existing vineyard lease, make costly renovations without proper permits, and potentially default on the loan they secured to cover estate taxes. I almost laughed. None of that is true. I know, but it shows their strategy. They're going to argue that you're impulsive, financially naive, and being influenced by people who don't have your best interests at heart. People like you. People like me. People like the family you're staying with. Anyone who's encouraged you to challenge their authority. What do we need to prove? We need to prove that your stepfather exceeded his legal authority, that his financial decisions weren't in your best interest, and that you're capable of managing your own affairs. How do we do that? We present evidence. Financial records showing the loan was unnecessary and disadvantageous. Documentation proving the vineyard lease could have been renewed if properly managed. Testimony about your exclusion from family decisions and the pattern of control your stepfather has exercised over your life. Will I have to testify? Yes. And you should be prepared for his attorney to question everything about your judgment, your motives, and your relationships. That evening, Lucas and I drove out to the property again. I wanted to walk through the house and the vineyard one more time before the hearing, to remind myself what I was fighting for. The house looked different in the fading light, more like the home grandmother Maggie had described in her stories about growing up there. I could imagine children playing in the yard, family dinners in the big kitchen, quiet evenings on the wraparound porch. "Are you nervous about testifying?" Lucas asked as we sat on the front steps. Terrified, but also ready. Ready for what? Ready to stop being ashamed of wanting something that's mine. Ready to stop apologizing for expecting to be treated like I matter. You've never needed to apologize for that. I know, but I've been doing it anyway. We were walking back to the car when my phone rang. Tyler's number. I hesitated, then answered. Natalie? Tyler's voice sounded different. Younger, less confident than usual. Hi, Tyler. I wanted to call you before the court thing next week. Okay. Dad's really angry. Like, angrier than I've ever seen him. He's been on the phone with lawyers all week, and he keeps talking about how you're trying to steal from the family. I'm not stealing anything, Tyler. I'm trying to take control of property that already belongs to me. That's not how he explains it. How does he explain it? Tyler was quiet for a moment. He says you've been brainwashed by people who want to get their hands on Grandma Maggie's money. He says you're going to lose everything if you don't stop this lawsuit. Do you believe him? Another long pause. I don't know what to believe, but I wanted you to know that he's planning to bring up some stuff about you in court. Personal stuff. What kind of personal stuff? Like how you've always been difficult. How you never really accepted our family. How you've been acting strange since Grandma Maggie died. My heart sank. I see. I'm not saying I agree with him, Tyler said quickly. I'm just warning you. Why? Because even though we're not really siblings, you're not a bad person. And some of the stuff he's planning to say isn't fair. It was the closest thing to kindness Tyler had ever shown me, even though it came with the casual dismissal that we weren't really siblings. It also came with a recognition that I didn't deserve what was about to happen. Thank you for telling me, I said. Yeah. Good luck, I guess. After I hung up, Lucas and I sat in his car for a long time, watching the stars appear over the hills. What kind of personal stuff do you think he meant? Lucas asked. Probably everything. My grades, my social life, my relationship with my mother, my attitude toward his family. Anything he can use to make me look unstable or ungrateful. Will any of it work? I thought about that question seriously. Would a judge look at my history of keeping my distance from Richard's family and conclude that I was the problem? Would my academic focus be interpreted as social isolation? Would my decision to leave home be seen as impulsive rather than necessary? I don't know, I said honestly, but I guess we're about to find out. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. James and I met twice to go over potential questions, review documents, and discuss strategy. Elena helped me choose appropriate clothes for court. Lucas drove me around town to clear my head when the stress became overwhelming. On Monday night, I called my mother one last time. "Tomorrow is the hearing," I said when she answered. "I know. Will you be there?" "Richard thinks I should be. To support the family." "Which family?" Mom was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how to answer that anymore." "You could try answering honestly." "Honestly? I don't know who I'm supposed to support." "My daughter. Who I love but who's challenging the man I married." "My husband. Who I trust but who seems determined to fight with my child." "I feel like no matter what I do, I lose someone I care about." "Mom, you're not going to lose me because I'm fighting for my inheritance, but you might lose me if you keep choosing Richard's comfort over my right to exist in this family." "That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? When was the last time you chose my feelings over his convenience?" She couldn't answer that question, which was answer enough. "I'll see you in court," I said, and hung up. Tuesday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything feel more serious and consequential. Elena drove me to the courthouse in downtown Portland, and Lucas met us there for moral support. "Remember," Elena said as we sat in her car outside the courthouse, "you're not on trial for being a good daughter or a grateful stepdaughter. You're here to prove that you have the right to control your own inheritance. What if they convince the judge that I'm not responsible enough? Then you appeal, but I don't think that's going to happen. You're one of the most responsible people I've ever met. You've only known me for a week. Sometimes a week is enough to see someone clearly." Inside the courthouse, James was waiting with a stack of documents and a calm expression that I hoped meant he was confident about our case. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I can be." "Remember, answer only the questions you're asked. Don't volunteer additional information, don't let them make you angry, and trust that the evidence speaks for itself." Richard was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit. He was wearing his best charcoal gray suit, and the kind of serious expression that suggested he was performing the role of concerned family patriarch. Mom sat in the gallery behind Richard's table, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Tyler and Madison flanked her on either side, both of them dressed like they were attending a funeral. They didn't look at me when I walked in. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge, Patricia Williams, presiding. Judge Williams was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had the kind of presence that suggested she'd heard every family dispute imaginable and had little patience for manipulation or theatrics. "Be seated," she said. "We're here today to review the petition filed by Natalie Harper challenging the guardianship arrangements established for her inheritance from Margaret Harper. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied. "Ready, Your Honor," Richard's attorney said. "Very well. Ms. Morrison, you may present your opening statement on behalf of the current guardian." Richard's attorney stood up and smoothed her skirt with practiced precision. "Your Honor, this case is about a grieving teenager who has been manipulated by adults seeking to gain access to a substantial inheritance. The respondent, Richard Blackwood, has served as a responsible guardian of these assets, making difficult financial decisions to preserve the estate for the beneficiary's future benefit. Ms. Harper's challenge to this arrangement is based on emotion rather than evidence, and granting her immediate control of these assets would put her inheritance at serious risk." She sat down, and Judge Williams turned to James. "Mr. Chen?" James stood and walked toward the bench with the confident stride of someone who knew he was about to present an airtight case. "Your Honor, this case is about a young woman's right to control her own inheritance, and the systematic abuse of guardianship authority by a stepfather who has prioritized his own interests over those of his ward. We will present evidence that Mr. Blackwood exceeded his legal authority, made financial decisions that benefited him rather than Ms. Harper, and has consistently excluded her from decisions about her own future. Ms. Harper is not a confused teenager being manipulated by adults. She is a competent young woman fighting to reclaim what was always rightfully hers." Judge Williams nodded and made a note on her legal pad. "Very well. Ms. Morrison, call your first witness." And with that, the battle for my future officially began. Richard's attorney called him as the first witness, and he walked to the stand with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being believed, without question. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth with the kind of sincerity that came from years of practice in boardrooms and business negotiations. "Mr. Blackwood," his attorney began, "please tell the court about your relationship with the respondent, Natalie Harper." "Natalie is my stepdaughter," Richard said, his voice carrying just the right note of paternal concern. "I married her mother 3 years ago, and I've tried to be a positive influence in her life during what I know has been a difficult adjustment period." "Can you describe the circumstances under which you assumed guardianship of her inheritance?" Natalie was 16 when her grandmother passed away, and she was devastated by the loss. The estate was complex, with significant tax implications and time-sensitive decisions that needed to be made. My wife and I felt it was important to protect Natalie from additional stress during her grieving process. "What kind of decisions needed to be made?" Richard leaned forward slightly, projecting the image of a responsible adult shouldering difficult burdens. The estate taxes were substantial, over $200,000. Without immediate action, the property would have been seized by the state. I had to secure financing quickly to preserve Natalie's inheritance. "And how did you secure this financing?" "I took out a loan against the property. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to prevent Natalie from losing everything her grandmother had left her." I watched Judge Williams taking notes, her expression neutral but attentive. Richard's version of events sounded reasonable, even noble. He was painting himself as the sacrificial stepfather who'd stepped in to save an ungrateful teenager's inheritance. "Mr. Blackwood, has Ms. Harper been involved in decisions regarding the property management?" "I've tried to include her, but she's shown little interest in the practical aspects of estate management. She's focused on her education and social activities, which is appropriate for someone her age. I've been handling the complex financial and legal issues so she can concentrate on being a teenager." "In your opinion, is Ms. Harper ready to assume full control of this inheritance?" Richard paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "I care deeply about Natalie, and I want what's best for her. But honestly, I'm concerned about her judgment. She's been influenced by people who may not have her best interests at heart, and she's made some impulsive decisions recently that worry me." "What kind of impulsive decisions?" "She left home suddenly, without discussion or explanation. She's living with people she barely knows. She's filed this lawsuit without understanding the potential consequences for her financial future. These aren't the actions of someone ready to manage $1 million estate." James scribbled notes furiously, but his expression remained calm. He'd predicted this line of attack. "Mr. Blackwood, you mentioned that Ms. Harper has been influenced by others. Can you elaborate? The family she's staying with, the lawyer she's hired, even some of her friends seem to be encouraging her to distrust the adults who've been caring for her. It's concerning to see a young person turn against her family based on outside influence." The attorney nodded sympathetically. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Williams turned to James. "Cross-examination, Mr. Chen?" "Thank you, Your Honor." James stood and approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Blackwood, you testified that you took out a loan to pay estate taxes. Do you have documentation showing that these taxes were actually due?" Richard's composure flickered slightly. "The estate attorney handled those details. But you don't have copies of the tax assessments or payment records?" "I trusted the professional advice I received." "I see. And this loan you secured? What was the interest rate?" "I don't recall the exact terms." James walked to his table and picked up a document. "According to the loan paperwork, the interest rate is 12%, with a balloon payment due in 5 years. Does that sound correct?" "If you say so." "Mr. Blackwood, are you aware that the current prime rate is approximately 7%? I'm not a financial expert. Yet you made a major financial decision on behalf of your stepdaughter without consulting her or exploring alternative financing options?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I acted quickly to protect her inheritance. Did you consider using your own assets to pay the taxes, then working out a repayment arrangement with Ms. Harper that didn't put her property at risk?" "That wasn't feasible." "Why not?" "It would have required liquidating investments at an unfavorable time." James nodded thoughtfully. So you chose to risk your stepdaughter's inheritance rather than inconvenience your own financial portfolio. That's not how I would characterize it. How would you characterize it? Richard was silent for a moment, clearly calculating his response. I made the best decision I could under difficult circumstances. Mr. Blackwood, you testified that Ms. Harper showed little interest in property management. When did you last invite her to participate in discussions about the vineyard lease renewal? I don't recall specific conversations. The lease expires in 6 months. Have you discussed renewal terms with Ms. Harper at all? The tenant hasn't expressed interest in renewing. Did you ask them about renewal, or did you simply inform them that renewal wasn't an option? Richard's discomfort was becoming more visible. I handled the communication with the tenant. And what was the nature of that communication? I told them that the property ownership was in transition and that we couldn't guarantee lease stability. James paused, letting the implications sink in. So you essentially told the tenant that they couldn't renew their lease, then used their lack of interest in renewal as justification for your stepdaughter not being ready to manage the property. That's a mischaracterization of my actions. Is it? Mr. Blackwood, you've testified that you care deeply about Ms. Harper. Can you tell the court when you last included her in a family photograph? The question caught Richard off guard. His attorney started to object, but Judge Williams held up a hand. I'll allow it. It goes to the witness's credibility regarding his relationship with the respondent. Richard shifted in his seat. Family photos aren't relevant to estate management. Please answer the question, when did you last include Ms. Harper in a family photograph? I don't keep track of every photo we take. What about Christmas cards? Was Ms. Harper included in this year's family Christmas card? A long pause. We decided to keep this year's card simple. Simple meaning it didn't include your stepdaughter? It included our immediate family. And Ms. Harper isn't part of your immediate family? Richard's facade finally cracked. She's part of our extended family structure, but yes, the photo included my wife and my children. Your children, but not hers. Tyler and Madison are my biological children. And Ms. Harper is your wife's biological daughter, correct? Yes. But somehow only your biological children qualified for the immediate family photo? Richard's attorney stood up. Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Your Honor. James replied, it goes directly to the witness's pattern of excluding Ms. Harper from family decisions and his credibility when he claims to care about her best interests. Judge Williams considered for a moment. I'll allow it, the witness will answer. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. Family dynamics are complicated. Indeed they are. No further questions, Your Honor. As Richard returned to his seat, his careful facade was gone. He looked angry, defensive, and smaller somehow than he had when he'd first taken the stand. The next witness was Dr. Patricia Wells, a family psychologist Richard's attorney had hired to testify about teenage decision-making and vulnerability to outside influence. Dr. Wells had impressive credentials and spoke with the kind of authority that came from years of academic study. But James had done his homework. Dr. Wells, he said during cross-examination, you've never actually met or evaluated Ms. Harper. Is that correct? That's correct. I'm here to provide expert testimony about adolescent psychology in general. So your opinions about Ms. Harper's mental state and decision-making capacity are based entirely on information provided by Mr. Blackwood's legal team? I've reviewed the relevant background materials. Materials selected and interpreted by people who are opposing Ms. Harper's petition. I've formed my own professional opinions based on the information available. Dr. Wells, in your professional opinion, what would be the psychological impact on a teenager of being systematically excluded from family photos and family decisions? Dr. Wells hesitated. That would depend on the specific circumstances. Would such exclusion typically result in feelings of rejection, abandonment, or unworthiness? It could, yes. And might a teenager in that situation eventually take steps to protect themselves from further emotional harm? That's possible. Would such self-protective behavior indicate psychological instability or psychological health? Dr. Wells was trapped. If she said it indicated instability, she'd be arguing that protecting yourself from emotional abuse was unhealthy. If she said it indicated health, she'd be supporting my decision to challenge Richard's authority. Self-protection is generally considered a healthy psychological response, she admitted. Thank you, Dr. Wells. No further questions. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs. The courtroom felt enormous, and I could feel Richard's eyes boring into me from across the room. James started with basic questions about my relationship with grandmother Maggie, my understanding of the inheritance, and my goals for the property. I answered as clearly as I could, trying to project competence and maturity. Ms. Harper, can you tell the court about your experience with property management and financial planning? I've been researching sustainable agriculture and organic farming practices for 2 years. I've taken business courses at the community college, and I've worked with agricultural extension agents to understand soil management and crop rotation. I also have practical experience from the summers I spent working on my grandmother's property. What are your specific plans for the vineyard? I want to transition to organic certification, which would increase the property value and rental income. I also want to add complementary crops and potentially agritourism elements that would diversify the revenue streams. Have you consulted with professionals about these plans? Yes. I've spoken with agricultural consultants, organic certification specialists, and small business advisors. I have preliminary cost estimates and projected timelines for all major improvements. James walked me through my research, my planning documents, and my understanding of the property's financial situation. I felt increasingly confident as I explained my vision for sustainable development and long-term growth. Then Richard's attorney stood up for cross-examination. Ms. Harper, you left your family home suddenly and without discussion. Would you characterize that as mature decision-making? I left after being threatened with having the police called on me for asking questions about my own inheritance. But you didn't attempt to resolve the conflict through family discussion? I had been attempting to have family discussions for weeks. Every time I asked questions about the property, I was told I was too young to understand, or that I should trust the adults to handle everything. Ms. Harper, isn't it true that you've never liked your stepfather? The question was designed to make me look petty and vindictive. I took a breath before answering. I've never felt accepted by my stepfather. There's a difference. Can you explain that difference? Richard has made it clear through his actions that I'm not part of his vision of family. I'm tolerated, not welcomed. That's not dislike on my part. That's recognition of reality. You weren't included in a family photo, and from that you concluded you weren't part of the family? I wasn't included in family photos, family vacation planning, family decision-making, or decisions about my own inheritance. The photo was just the most obvious example of a consistent pattern. Ms. Harper, don't you think you might be overreacting to normal blended family adjustment issues? I looked across the courtroom at my mother, who was staring down at her hands, at Tyler and Madison, who were watching me with expressions that mixed curiosity with disdain, at Richard, whose face showed barely controlled anger. No, I said quietly. I don't think wanting to be treated like I matter is an overreaction. The attorney tried a few more angles, but James had prepared me well. I stayed calm, answered only what was asked, and didn't let her provoke me into emotional outbursts. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt like I'd survived something important. Judge Williams called for a brief recess before closing arguments. Elena and Lucas were waiting for me in the hallway, and Elena immediately wrapped me in a hug. You did beautifully, she said. You sounded exactly like what you are, a competent young woman who knows her own mind. How do you think it's going? I asked James. Better than I expected. Richard's testimony revealed more about his motivations than his attorney probably wanted, and your testimony was compelling. We have a good chance. When court reconvened, Richard's attorney made a final plea about protecting young people from their own inexperience and the influence of adults who might exploit their inheritances. James countered with a passionate argument about the right of competent adults to control their own property, and the abuse of guardianship authority by people more interested in control than protection. Your Honor, James concluded, Ms. Harper isn't asking this court to validate her feelings or resolve her family conflicts. She's asking for what should be hers by right, control over her own inheritance, and the opportunity to succeed or fail based on her own decisions rather than someone else's convenience. Judge Williams retired to consider her ruling. The wait felt endless. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. This case presents a conflict between protection and autonomy. she began. The court must balance the legitimate need to protect inheritance assets with the equally legitimate right of competent adults to control their own property. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. After reviewing the evidence, the court finds that while Mr. Blackwood's initial guardianship may have been well-intentioned, his subsequent actions suggest a pattern of exceeding his authority and prioritizing control over the beneficiary's actual interests. I felt Lucas squeeze my hand. The loan secured against the property was obtained at unfavorable terms, without exploring alternative options. The lease negotiations were conducted in a manner that reduced the property's value rather than protecting it. Most significantly, Ms. Harper has been systematically excluded from decisions about her own inheritance. Judge Williams looked directly at me. Ms. Harper has demonstrated substantial knowledge about property management, clear plans for the estate's future, and the kind of maturity that comes from having to advocate for herself when the adults around her failed to include her in important decisions. Richard's face had gone pale. Therefore, the court hereby dissolves the guardianship arrangement and transfers all authority over the estate to Ms. Harper, effective immediately. Mr. Blackwood will provide a full accounting of all estate-related transactions within 30 days. The loan secured against the property will be reviewed by an independent financial advisor to determine whether it was obtained with proper authority. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the silent courtroom. I had won. James was shaking my hand and talking about next steps, but I barely heard him. I was looking across the courtroom at my family, wondering if this victory felt like closure or just another beginning. Richard stood abruptly and walked out without looking back. Tyler and Madison followed him, their expressions mixing confusion with resentment. Mom remained seated for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then she stood slowly and walked over to where I was sitting. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "Thank you. I'm sorry it came to this. Are you sorry it happened or sorry it was necessary?" Mom's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you better." It wasn't the apology I'd been hoping for, but it was more honest than anything she'd said in months. "I love you, Mom," I said. "But I can't keep sacrificing my own well-being to preserve a family dynamic that doesn't include me." "I know," she whispered. "I hope someday you can forgive me for taking so long to see that." 6 months later, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandmother's house, watching the sunrise paint the vineyard in shades of gold and green. The house had running water now, and electricity, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and fresh bread instead of dust and memories. Lucas emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air. "The organic certification inspector is coming today," he said, settling beside me on the porch swing. "Nervous?" "Excited. If we pass, we'll be able to charge premium rates for the vineyard lease, and the farm stand will be able to market everything as certified organic." The farm stand had been my first major project after taking control of the property. It started as a simple roadside structure selling vegetables from the kitchen garden I'd expanded, but it had grown into a popular destination for people seeking fresh, locally grown produce. "Any word from your mom?" Lucas asked. "She called yesterday. Things are tense at home, but she's coming to the farm stand opening next week." "What about Richard?" "Still fighting the loan review. Still insisting he was protecting my interests." I took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. "Tyler's going to community college in the fall. Madison made varsity soccer. Life goes on." "Do you miss it, being part of a traditional family?" I thought about the question seriously. I missed the idea of family, the fantasy of belonging somewhere without having to earn it. But I didn't miss the reality of constantly monitoring my behavior to avoid conflict, or the exhaustion of trying to prove I deserved basic consideration. "I miss my mom," I said finally, "but I don't miss feeling invisible in my own life." Lucas nodded. Elena had become something of a second mother to me, and their house felt more like home than any place I'd lived since grandmother Maggie died. But it wasn't the same as having your original family choose to include you. "You know what I don't miss?" I continued. "I don't miss waiting for other people to decide what I deserve." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the vineyard come alive in the morning light. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. Somewhere in the distance, A tractor started up as our neighbors began their own daily routines. My phone buzzed with a text from the agricultural consultant confirming our appointment to discuss expanding into berry cultivation. Another message from the Small Business Association about the marketing workshop I'd signed up for. A year ago, I'd been counting down days until I could escape a life that felt too small for my actual size. Now I was building something bigger than I'd ever imagined possible. You know what the best part is? I said to Lucas. What? I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm creating something that will last. He smiled and reached for my hand. Your grandmother would be proud. I thought about Maggie's letter, hidden in the cedar chest upstairs, about her belief that I understood the value of growing things with patience and care, about her conviction that I could nurture what others might give up on. She'd been right about more than just the property. She'd been right about me. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just contentment, but genuine peace. The kind that comes from knowing you belong exactly where you are, because you built it yourself. 2 years later, the vineyard was thriving under organic management, the farm stand had expanded into a small restaurant featuring locally sourced ingredients, and I was finishing my degree in sustainable agriculture through a distance learning program that let me study while managing the property. I never did receive a Christmas card from the Blackwood family, but every December I sent one to relatives and friends, featuring a photo of me standing in front of the farmhouse, surrounded by the life I'd built from scratch. In the photo, I'm smiling without reservation. Not because I'm posing for someone else's version of happiness, but because I'm genuinely joyful about the work I'm doing and the person I've become. I look like someone who belongs exactly where she is. Because I do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.